From London, I'm John Weeks, and this is The Standard. In part 2 of today's episode, one for the culture vultures, why the V&A's newest exhibition, Fragile Beauty, has been given 5 stars by our acting culture editor, Nick Clark. But before that, recycling. It's fairly simple, right? You take your empty plastic bottle, find the nearest recycling bin, and you've done your bit. However, it's what happens after you've binned that bottle that really counts. According to new data, London is the worst area of the country for recycling, with plastic waste ending up all over the place. Some goes on a night train to Bristol to be burned in incinerators, while over 1 million tonnes a year is sent abroad as far away as China. Recent government figures show that in 22-23, only 32.7% of household waste in the capital actually went to recycling centres, the lowest of any region in England. And it's clearly a big issue to deal with. The average Brit produces about 1.3 kilos of waste every single day. A real challenge to deal with, particularly in a densely populated city. So, is the green messaging around recycling actually untrue? And who's in charge of properly disposing of recycling materials in the capital? Joining me now is Oliver Franklin-Wallis, author of the book Wasteland, the dirty truth about what we throw away, where it goes, and why it matters. So, Oliver, is anything we throw away in London actually recycled?
That's the big question everyone wants to know, isn't it, when it comes to recycling? The good news is that, yes, the recycling rate in London it's about in line with the UK's national figures, but like so often in the UK, it really depends on where you live, and the difference between the best recycling boroughs, the most sustainable boroughs, and the worst performing boroughs is still pretty huge. So if you live in somewhere like, I don't know, Tower Hamlets, your recycling rate is pretty low. But if you live out in somewhere like, I don't know, Wimbledon or something like that, then the recycling rate tends to be pretty high and in line with national averages. And this kind of comes back to the system that we have in this country, which is it's down to local authorities. So, whether you live inside London or you live in one of the counties, everyone does things a little bit differently. And there's been some kind of attempts over the last few years to bring those in line nationally, but we've kind of gone a bit back and forth on it, and so far I don't seem to have got anywhere.
And London has been picked out as the worst region in the country. Why is that the case? What do the figures say? What makes the capital so bad for recycling?
Well, there's a number of factors here. Many of them are historical. If you look back to Victorian times even, and parts of East London would ship their waste out to Essex and dump it on the marshlands, and parts of West London would ship it elsewhere. So there's all of these kind of historical factors at play, London being such a huge city. If you live in, for example, I think Bromley recycles about 50%, 49% of its household waste, as I say. That's partly down to really robust collection. You've got lots of wealthy households who've got times to sort through things. Whereas, if you're living in a community that has a lot of really dense, high-rise flats or apartments, for example, where there's less segregation, often there's literally fewer bins, there's fewer ways to separate recycling, and it means things get muddled together, it gets contaminated and dirty, and it's just not worth separating as much. So that kind of covers one part of it. A second part of it is just the contracts that different parts of London, London boroughs have with waste collecting companies, with waste companies, right? So, for example, in my book, I followed waste from West London, which actually travels on overnight trains, they call them bin liners, to the banks of the Severn near Bristol, where it's burnt in a large waste-to-energy plant. That's part of a long-running contract to generate energy from that waste. And the thing about those contracts, and there's several of them in the Greater London area, there's kind of back and forth about whether we should build more, is that they directly compete with the recycling, right? Because the things that burn really well, plastics, paper, wood, are also things that we'd want to recycle. So it really comes down to kind of policy choice and environmental choices over what we want to do with our waste. Do we want to recycle it? Do we want to try and get some kind of slightly cleaner energy from it? So there's all sorts of reasons that goes into it. Broadly speaking, as a city, globally, London doesn't do terribly. I don't need to defend the capital, but it's not dreadful, but there's definitely a huge amount of room for improvement.
And you mentioned councils obviously doing sort of their own thing depending on where you live. But who's sort of ultimately in charge of dealing with recycling in London?
Well, as so often with London, it's kind of in a unique position nationally, in that you have the mayor who has control of certain levers, local councils controlling others, and then there's obviously the bigger question of the strategy, the national strategy coming from Westminster. Sadiq Khan, for example, said a few years ago that he wanted London to be a zero waste city and set a bunch of pretty aggressive recycling targets. I think it was no biodegradable waste or recyclables sent to landfill by 2030. By 2026, actually, and by 2030, a 65% municipal recycling rate. We're way off that, like absolutely miles away from getting that as citywide. But by the same token, nationally, recycling has been flatlining for some time. It's actually gone down in some places. And that comes down to various issues. But a big one is just the fact that there's no consistency. So if you're a waste company that deals with, say, compost, right? Quite often, you can literally, there are some places in the country where, one street will have one rule on compost and the next street over is not collected at all. So you end up with these very strange kind of jigsaw effects. And that makes it very hard to plan a waste collection system for a whole country. So the Conservatives tried to pass the Environment Bill, they did pass the Environment Bill a few years ago. I think it was 2021 now, which was going to bring all this in line. And the idea was to have a national strategy and national agreed standards on the kind of waste that we collect and who deals with it. But there's been all sorts of lobbying against it. Different kind of politicians are now going against it. And you may remember Rishi Sunak's 7 bins kind of controversy from last autumn. And the long and short of that is now that the Conservatives have said that there's going to be a new recycling strategy called Simpler Recycling, which I think supposed to come into effect in 2026. But I don't know why it's so difficult to pass, to be honest, because it's been like 5 years now or something since they said that they would sort this out. And it does kind of speak to a level of inaction, whether that's in local government, whether that's in City Hall, whether that's in Westminster, to what is clearly a huge environmental problem. And, I know this from my commute into London every day. I know this from friends who live locally. You only need to look in our drains. You only need to look in the state of the Thames. You only need to look at, our hedgerows to see that waste is still a huge problem in the capital, and we need to get a hold of it.
So as someone who's literally written the book on it, what is the solution here, Ollie?
Well, simpler standards, like giving everybody the same standards, will make a huge difference. Like making sure that food waste, for example, is a huge environmental challenge, because I think about 30% of all food that we grow globally is wasted. Meanwhile, food waste accounts for about between 8 and 10% of all CO2 emissions. So, if you can tackle food waste, then not only can you feed some very hungry people, you can also tackle the climate crisis. It's one of the simplest ways to lower the emissions of food waste is to have food waste collections, garden waste collections. We don't have that unanimously across the country. So standardizing those kind of things will make it really easy for the waste industry to kind of build up infrastructure and do all the things we need to do. And the second thing is that we all need to just think a bit more about the kind of things that we're making. Well, do we need insane levels of plastics on all of our fruit and vegetables? Does everything need to be as complicated as it is in terms of design? And the things we're buying, because the majority of waste is not in the packet that we throw away. It happens kind of upstream from that. If you think about an iPhone, the box of the iPhone isn't a big deal. Even the iPhone isn't a big deal. It's the tons and hundreds of tons of rock and things that have been mined somewhere else on the other side of the planet that creates this huge waste footprint. So it's those kind of things that we need to be thinking about, a more systemic change than, whether we're washing our yogurt pots correctly or throwing away our pizza boxes at the right time.
Let's take a quick break now. Coming up in part 2, our acting culture editor, Nick Clark, explains why he's given 5 stars to the V&A's Fragile Beauty exhibition.
There are just so many different discoveries to find in this exhibition. I think that's what really knocked me backwards, really. There's just so much there to discover.
I'm now joined by Nick Clark, acting culture editor for The Standard, who's given 5 stars to the V&A's newest exhibition called Fragile Beauty. So Nick, first of all, what is this exhibition all about?
So it's called Fragile Beauty, photographs from the Sir Elton John and David Furnish collection. It's at the V&A, and it is a somewhat exhaustive look at the collection of Elton John and David Furnish. They are passionate collectors of photography, And they've built up since, I think, the early 90s, an absolutely extraordinary collection of photographs. All the big hitters are there. There's loads of famous shots. And there's, a vast array of hidden gems I'd never seen before and were absolutely delighted by. But essentially, it's the big new show at the V&A, and it's well worth your time.
And I think my favourite photograph, looking at the few that are on the V&A website, is the Elton John with egg on his face photo. Why are these photographs so impressive?
So it's interesting, actually, that you pull that one out, because it's the only picture of Elton John in the whole thing, even though it's his collection, and I'm sure he has many more. But of this one, what they've decided to do is really delve into them as collectors rather than them as subjects. I mean, that is a wonderful picture with him with the eggs on his face. But essentially what they're trying to do is give the public a look at, him as a collector, or them as collectors. And there's such an extraordinary range. I mean, they just leap off the walls. There are photographers that I think many people have heard of. There's Cindy Sherman, there's Robert Mapplethorpe, Sam Taylor Johnson, William Eggleston, Diane Arbus, and many more that many people wouldn't have heard of, including myself, that are actually sort of there to discover. It's what it feels like is a sort of extraordinary look over basically from the 50s onwards to now. It just looks like a kind of cherry picking some of the great photographs of recent history, really.
I understand you were particularly struck by the reportage section. Why was that?
So there are 300 images. I mean, they're taken from a collection of 7,000 images to give you some indication of the scale of their collection. It's extraordinary, but they've had to split them up into sections just basically to help guide people through the exhibition. There's 9 different sections, all with different themes. And one of them is this reportage section, news photography. And wow, I mean, there are some really famous pictures here. There's pictures of war, of assassinations, there's of student protests, there's all sorts of things. I mean, there are moments here which will bring you absolutely up short. I mean, I came around the corner to see The Falling Man, the famous picture from 9/11. And it's one that will still leave people devastated. It certainly did to me. It was a real shock to see it there. And others of a student being shot dead during the riots in the 60s. I mean, you can't fail to be affected. I mean, to be honest, though, it is just one of the sections, and they all bring different emotions. This one is particularly harrowing because they're sort of true life documentary. But, all the other ones as well bring sort of emotions from happiness, joy, but also sadness and these intimate moments as well. So that is a real fascinating section, but there are many others as well. And there are just so many different discoveries to find in this exhibition. I think that's what really knocked me backwards, really. There's just so much there to discover.
That's it. And I know you don't like to give 5 stars lightly. Is that what sets this exhibition apart for you, Nick, from others that you've seen? Just the sheer sort of rollercoaster of emotions that you experience?
Absolutely. It really shows what photography can do. It shows the sort of glorious nature of the art form of capturing these moments, split-second human moments. Humanity runs through this. And what's brilliant about it, I suppose, it has the big hitters. It has images that many people going will recognize and sort of lovely to see up close. But it also has these hidden gems that people won't have seen. So not only do you get that sort of frisson of seeing things that very famous images that but it gives you a chance to find names that you had no idea and that you will definitely be going to sort of research on and find more about. And I think many people will find, even in like little corners, just photographers they'll never have heard about, that they are desperate to find out more. And I think that's what exhibitions, great 5-star exhibitions do. They educate, but with the lightest of touches. You feel like you just want to wade deep into it. I mean, I can't wait to go back.
Pick up the Evening Standard newspaper for more news, interviews and analysis, or head to standard.co.uk. Thanks for listening. We're back tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock.